Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. This is Eloy, owner of Third Eye Games and GM extraordinaire. I've been running games for who knows how long at this point. Since I was 13, I've been running games and specifically been running games at conventions and also at home. So I actually do have a video here on the channel that's talking about how to run games at conventions. Go check that one out. I'll make sure that that's the pinned comment here on this video. But today I wanted to answer that question that always seems to pop up whenever I'm on a GM, a Game Master panel where people are like, I want the masters to tell me how to run my game better. And occasionally, I'm not going to say it always comes up, but we get the question of what if the players call the cops? In today's climate, of course, that is a lot of people's go-to. You know, they're like, anything that's bothering me right now, I'm going to call the cops on it. But that rarely happens in RPGs. A lot of the time, the real answer that they do is they're like, oh, well, I'm going to take out my weapon and kill it, which is even harsher sometimes. But I guess I understand it. You have a little bit more agency when it comes to an RPG. But there are a variety of different things that can happen if you were to call the police during an RPG. First, I'll say is that it does widely depend on the genre. There is a difference between calling the police in a fantasy setting, which means it's usually like guys with spears that are maybe slightly bigger than the swords or spears that you currently have. They might also have archery, but they're like a lot of the time in fantasy games, it's like Town's Guard, and they're not actually all of that really intimidating until you start getting up to like, oh, well, now it's a city guard. Well, now it's the Imperial Guard. Now it's the personal bodyguard to the king. And it's like, okay, well, all right, cool. Well, that one's definitely bigger. But like your general garden variety law enforcement in a fantasy game is going to be a lot less intimidating than like monsters. If you go in a modern setting, obviously we're talking about the police officers that would be called to a thing. And there are different categories of that. You know, there's like the standard police officer that comes out and helps keep the peace and whatnot. Then there's detectives, and they're a little bit more observant, and, you know, they're the ones kind of in charge of cases and whatnot. And obviously there's ranks within that too. There's, you know, like there's SWAT, and then there's like snipers, and, you know, it goes up from there. But like the majority of like the police officers that you would have in a modern setting would be your normal police officers, is what you would normally run into. In a sci-fi setting, oh my god, you can go in a lot of different directions in a sci-fi setting. You're talking different alien types. You're talking like genetically or cybernetically enhanced, you know, units and whatnot. So there's a lot to talk about in terms of a sci-fi setting. But let's keep this modern for this conversation. So the question here is, what happens if the players call the cops? And the first answer to that is, well, they can attempt to call the cops, but maybe they can't get through. This is actually something I've seen in a couple of different games that focus a lot on like the horror genre, is that they'll write up these monsters and it'll actually have abilities for the monsters that say, cell phones and like calling and everything, that stuff doesn't work when they're around. And that can have a variety of different reasons. We've seen in like a lot of pop culture, it's either like, oh, it's taking place in the woods, so there's no reception, or maybe there's an outage in town, or like maybe their phone dies. That's actually a big one. Their phone dies and they just don't have a charger on them. So there's a lot of reasons why they just can't call the cops. What's the first thing that happens when they do call the cops, though? Well, if they do call the cops, let's say the cops do show up. The question here is, what is the police officer's response? Now, I know most RPGs that I play in, the characters are largely like decked out. They have like magic items and weapons and swords and guns, and they have all of these things. And that's kind of the problem with the good guy with a gun argument, is that the police officers show up, and if you have a weapon, they're going to immediately believe that you are the enemy. So the first thing that can happen when you call the cops is they think you're the enemy, and they kind of start making your job harder than it even could be. right? So you're fighting a monster, you're having issues, let's call the cops. Now the cops show up and they're fighting you and the monster, and it doesn't really help you. And when I say modern, that could be straight modern, that could be modern fantasy, this could be superheroes, that could be anything. The second option that can happen is, what if you didn't even call the cops? What if the cops just show up and whoever you are up against, the bad guy, maybe he's a mind flayer, maybe he's a supervillain with mind control powers, but you call the cops thinking you're going to get help, and they are turned against you. They can actually become your next enemy. And that's actually kind of a scary thing, because you're like, oh, I got the reinforcements. This is going to be so good. They're going to help me. Yay. And then it's totally turned on you. And that's definitely not the case. And another spin on that is that the cops could show up and maybe they've been in league with the bad guy the whole time. So they do show up, and they don't need to be further mind controlled. They're already kind of in on it. So they immediately arrest you. The bad guy runs away, and they immediately arrest the players. And they're like, you're coming with us. And the players are like, but there was a thing over there. What's happening? So I do like the dark conspiracy idea there. And the last option is, honestly, sometimes the cops just don't show up. We've been kind of conditioned in TV and movies and all of that stuff that, like, if you call the cops are there. But as Flava Flav has warned us for decades, 911 sometimes is a joke. And I know for a fact that if you live in a primarily black neighborhood, the cops don't show up as quickly as they would if you're in an affluent neighborhood. So if you're playing these like kind of run-of-the-mill heroes and there is somebody with political, financial, like they're wealthy, if they have power, the cops will show up quicker because the cops will want to come and they will want to protect that bad guy. Honestly, in the end, they'll think you're the ruffians. And also, if the players have any kind of power, they might actually show up early. But also consider the type of neighborhood where a rundown, like haunted house with like that's scary and people don't like to cross, like that kind of place doesn't really exist in like the suburbs and like in the really nice ritzy parts of town. So even if we just take out all supernatural, influence over the police or anything, if you say, hey, I'm at the corner of blah and blah where a haunted house is and we need help, the cops are going to be like, we're not going out there. Or if they are, they might show up hours later. And that happens a lot of the time, again, in primarily black neighborhoods where you call the cops, they don't show up. They just don't show up in time to actually help you with anything. So that was just kind of like an interesting conversation that I wanted to have about what happens when players call cops in an RPG. A lot of the time, it's going to complicate things even further. That's why Batman would be like, hey, cops, stay out of my way, let me do this. That's why Buffy the Vampire Slayer never called the cops. They're like, I'm a slayer, I can handle this, it'll be fine. You also don't want to include people who aren't in the know about the things that you're fighting. You don't want to bring them into your fight. They don't have special weapons. They don't have anything. If you're fighting a vampire and the cop shows up, what are they going to do? Shoot it? Bullets don't hurt a vampire. What are you even thinking? So anyway, that's my take on what happens if you call the cops in an RPG. Let me know about stuff that's happened in your guys' game kind of down in the comments. I'd love to hear stories about what happens when players call cops. I love the idea of this. But let me know about all that stuff down in the comments. Otherwise, don't forget to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell notification so you always know when I post the next video where I'm talking about whatever I feel like talking about. And until next time, thank you very much, and you have a good day.